Today's lecture is going to be about what is called contemporary, two groups of theories that are under the umbrella of what's called contemporary compatibilism. Those are mesh theories and reasons responsiveness theories. And we'll get to what those are in just a moment. But I will say up front that there is a lot of content here for this lecture. So it will go a little quick in parts. I'll slow down in certain parts where it's a little, I think, more important to slow down. But there's a lot in this chapter, and so there's a decent amount of content here to cover. So we'll try to be summary-like and go through it relatively quickly where I can. But as always, I have office hours, so email me questions or come to office hours if anything's unclear. But all right, so let's jump right into it. A little refresher of kind of the central ideas that we're going to be talking about, obviously, determinism, moral responsibility, free will, and then this compatibilist burden that McKenna talks about in the chapter. We'll start there. So again, determinism is just the view, and McKenna goes through these definitions at the beginning. That's kind of why I'm doing it here also. Determinism is the view that the past and the laws of nature entail only one possible future, okay? Just by necessity, once you have some past, say like the first state of the universe, and then the laws of nature, that guarantees only one possible future. Every state after that is guaranteed by the one before it. Okay. So moral responsibility is this idea from, if you remember, from Dirk Perboom. We're just understanding it as this basic dessert sense of responsibility, which is that to be responsible means that you deserve either blame or praise, depending on if the action you did was right or wrong, just because you freely and knowingly perform that action. Okay, that's in the sense of being backwards looking. So what justifies you saying someone is morally responsible, saying you're morally responsible, is not forward looking. It's not because it produces really good consequences to hold you morally responsible. It's backwards looking. So what justifies your status as being blameworthy, say, if you did a wrong action, what justifies saying that you're blameworthy is that you actually performed some wrong action in the past and you knew it was wrong and nothing, you weren't being coerced or anything like that. And so to be morally responsible is to deserve blame or praise simply because you freely and knowingly performed some right or wrong action in the past. Okay. And then free will is just the control that's required for responsibility. So how much control do you need to exercise in order to deserve blame or praise for your action? Well, whatever that is, whatever the amount of control is required in order to be morally responsible, we just call that free will. Okay. It's this ability to exercise the control that's needed to be morally responsible for your action. Okay. And then free actions, so that's free will is the ability, the capacity for that sort of control. And then free actions are just those actions that are caused or, that involve the exercising of that ability to, control that action in a sense that's required for moral responsibility. Okay, two main competing positions. Incompatibilism is the idea that these two things here are incompatible with determinism. If the world is determined, then we can't have these things. That's incompatibilism, right? It's not compatible with determinism. And this is where we see the split between libertarians who think this stuff cannot go together with determinism, but we do have this stuff. Sometimes people act freely. Sometimes people are morally responsible. And therefore, libertarians, since their main claim is that we do have free will, well, one of their central claims is that we do have free will, they have to say that determinism is false. Because they think, it's basically three claims, right? Moral responsibility and free will are not compatible with determinism. We do have free will and moral responsibility. Therefore, determinism has to be false. That's libertarians. Skeptics are also incompatibilists. They think moral responsibility and free will are not compatible with determinism, but they think nobody has free will. And sometimes they think it's because determinism is true. Sometimes they think it's because free will and moral responsibility are also not compatible with indeterminism, so the opposite of determinism. So whether or not the world is determined or undetermined, still you can't have free will and moral responsibility, and since the world has to be one of those ways, Nobody's responsible. But the point here is just incompatibilism. The main thing of incompatibilism is just that free will and responsibility are not compatible with this kind of world where the past and the laws of nature entail only one future. People who think that's a problem for free will and moral responsibility are called incompatibilists, but then they split on whether they think we have free will or not. Okay. And then compatibilism, which is the view we'll talk about today in more detail, is the idea that all this stuff can go together. Even if determinism is true, even if it's true that there's only one possible future, right now, there's only one thing I can do right now with my thinking, my movements, the cells in my body, the atoms in this table that I'm sitting at, there's only one future for them. The direction they're going to go, the kind of process they're going to engage in, only one possible thing they can do at any time, including people and agents, not just atoms and molecules, but people, humans, animals, our brains, everything, only one thing it can do. And compatibilists think you can still have free will and moral responsibility even if there's only one possible future. Determinism is not a threat. Okay, so, and this is the view we're going to focus on, in particular, a certain kind, two certain kinds of compatibilism. But what does the compatibilist have to do here? So McKenna starts by saying, look, what's the compatibilist burden? What do they have to show? And this should remind you of Kane's incompatibilist mountain. So if you think that determinism is not a problem, so if we start with this question, is determinism a problem for free will? Compatibilists say no. They answer that by saying no. And so what does that mean? Well, what that means is they have to first identify what are the conditions, what's required and enough for free will and moral responsibility. If they think that determinism does not rule out free will, then what they have to say is, here are the factors, here are the things that will give you enough control in order to say that you're free and responsible. And the reason that they have to say what the sufficient conditions are, what it means to exercise enough control to be responsible. They can't just say what's required. They can't just say, oh, free will, it requires the ability to do otherwise. It requires some knowledge. It requires some awareness of your action, maybe. They can't just say that. They have to say, whenever you get these things, X, Y, and Z, whatever they are, then that's enough to say someone's free and responsible. Because these things that they say are enough, the things that they're going to pick out, are going to be compatible with determinism. And because whatever they say free will and responsibility is, it has to end up being compatible with determinism. Determinism cannot rule out free will and responsibility, or cannot rule out the conditions the compatibilists give for free will and moral responsibility. Because whatever they say free will is, whatever the conditions are that are good enough to have free will and responsibility, whatever kind of control is enough for responsibility, it has to end up being compatible with only one possible future. Okay, and because of that, since they have to tell us what free will and responsibility is in a way that's compatible with determinism, in a way that's compatible with only one possible future, typically what they're doing is trying to say it's about telling us how we can be caused in the right way, and really how our actions can be caused in the right way. So a free action or an action for which you can be responsible has features X, Y, and Z, and those features are going to be about what caused that action. When certain things cause your actions or your thoughts, whatever, then that means those actions and thoughts are not controlled, not free or responsible. But when other certain things, like whatever they tell us is good enough, when those things cause your actions or your thoughts, or when your actions or thoughts are caused in certain kinds of ways, then that's enough for it to be free or responsible. That's what they're trying to show us. And then the different views just fill in these things for different stuff. They say, here's the right kind of cause in order to be free. If your action's caused in this way, that's good enough for free will. And someone says, no, I think there's problems there. If your action's caused in this way, then that's good enough for free will. That's kind of what they're doing, okay? All right. And then McKenna says the other thing that they have to do is whatever they fill in for these, whatever they say is enough for freedom and responsibility, those conditions have to be plausible enough for people to actually have free will and moral responsibility. Libertarians have this burden as well because they think people do have free will. So whatever libertarians say is required for free will and responsibility, right? And they'll say certain things are required, and some of those things might be incompatible. So, for instance, they might say free will requires the ability to do otherwise, or free will requires causing your actions without being caused to cause them. Like this uncaused power you have. And determinism rules that out, maybe they think. But then they still need to tell us how it's plausible that people can have that, because they think we have free will. Skeptics, it's an interesting question we won't get into, but it's not really clear. They have this burden. John Fisher disagrees. John Martin Fisher, who we'll talk about down below, has a paper called what's it called? The Playing the Cards That Are Dealt You. And he argues basically in that paper that skeptics also have this burden, that their conditions that they require for free will and responsibility need to be plausible enough for people to be able to meet them. We don't want to have these crazy conditions like you have to create yourself. In order to be free, you have to create yourself. Well, nobody can create themselves, therefore nobody's free. Fisher's going to say, well, the things that you're requiring are too high of a standard. We don't need that high of a standard. So anyways, the point is, we won't talk about libertarians or skeptics further down below, but for compatibilists, at least, there are these burdens. They have to say what the sufficient conditions are, and they have to, those conditions that they pick out have to be plausible enough for people to have them, because they think people can be free. Right, yeah. If the conditions are too strong, then nobody's going to have it. This is like what I was talking about with the skeptics. But if the conditions are too weak, if they say, oh, and we'll get to this, being free just requires doing what you want. Some people are going to say, well, I mean, okay, sure, people do what they want, so that's a real thing that people do. But is that really freedom? That seems kind of weak. Nobody's going to really care about that kind of action. So we'll get to that. But those are the two burdens. All right. So now there's this distinction between classical and contemporary compatibilism. Now, we've seen some classical compatibilism stuff. This was the to be free is to do what you want. So classical compatibilism was focused on doing what you want without being impeded from the outside. So like without being forced. Someone forces you at gunpoint. Someone chains you up. Someone holds you down. Someone physically picks you up or holds you and moves you around, like getting thrown out of a club by a bouncer or something like that. That's not a free action, right? Because even if you wanted to leave the club or the bar and you're like, I have the desire to leave, and you are just about to start walking out, and then a bouncer comes and picks you up and throws you out, you didn't freely leave, even though you did what you wanted. You didn't really do anything, really. So doing what you want without any external impediments, as long as there's no external things influencing you that are deviant or forceful or coercive or whatever, and if you're doing what you want, your action aligns with what you want to do, then you're free. That's enough. And so you can see it's kind of weak. It's kind of a plain, simple, watered down, maybe you might think, kind of version of what it is to act freely. And it's pretty clear that determinism is not a threat to this, right? You can be determined to want something, and then you can be determined to choose what you want. So I might be determined to like coffee, and then when I go perform a bunch of coffee drinking actions or coffee pursuing actions, maybe those are even determined. Maybe the world is determined. But that wouldn't undermine the fact that I like things and I act in accordance with those desires. So you can still do what you want without any external impediments. It might be just determined that nobody forces me or coerces me today to drink coffee, right? So all of these things, you can get this, doing what you want without impediments, even if determinism is true. It's pretty easily. So it's just about not being coerced, and the world might have been determined so that you weren't coerced to perform some action. Okay. And determinism also, they would argue, the classical compatibilists, it does not take away the ability to do otherwise. So if you remember, this was called the conditional analysis, because what they said was, in order for it to be true that you could have done otherwise, So let's say I take a drink of coffee, or I make myself some coffee and I drink coffee this morning. Well, could I have not made coffee? Well, the conditional analysis of ability to do otherwise, the classical compatibilists are going to say, yeah, you could have not drinking coffee, even though drunken coffee, even though it might have been determined in this world, in the actual world, that you were going to drink coffee this morning. If the past had been different, if you had wanted differently, maybe you had in a different alternative past, if things would have gone differently, then you wouldn't have a desire for coffee. Maybe you would have hated coffee if the past had just been a little bit different. And then you wouldn't have wanted, right? So if you had wanted differently with some different past, then you would have chosen differently. So you do have the ability to do otherwise, because if things had gone different, then you would have chosen differently, wanted differently, and chosen differently. So that's a kind of simplified, at least, version of the conditional analysis. There are more sophisticated versions. We're not going to talk about that. But that's the idea. And so the classical compatibilists hold on to free will and responsibility in the face of determinism, but not by giving up ability to do otherwise. They thought you still need the ability to do otherwise in order to be free, but determinism doesn't threaten that either. Okay. That was the classical compatibilist. But now there were some problems, and I think we've talked about this a little bit in some of the other lectures, but sometimes just doing what you want is not enough for free will, right? Addicts, people with phobias, other kinds of mental disorders, delusions, these sometimes part of the nature of the mental disorder is that you have certain desires that you can't control and that are kind of what we'll call alien to you. Right? The whole problem, some people think, with addiction is that you have these desires that don't really feel like they belong to you. You desire to do certain things, but you don't really want to desire to do those things. You're like, gosh, I have this craving to drink or to smoke cigarettes or whatever it is for the addict. And then they think, I wish I didn't. I don't want to smoke, but I can't help it. I have this craving and it's so strong that... So it's about, a lot of people think, at least at the core, maybe not the only thing about addiction, but one thing that people really think about addiction a lot of the time is that there are these desires that seem like they're kind of alien. They're not really your own. And if you act on those desires, it's not necessarily true that you're acting fully, freely, and responsible. But it would still be true that you're doing what you want, because you do want... It's still a desire. A want is just a desire. You still want that thing. And so the point is, sometimes just doing what you want is not enough for free will and responsibility. Right? And this view says that it is. Free will and responsibility is just doing what you want without external impediments. So that's some problems. It includes too much, basically, is the worry here. It's going to tell us that all these people are free and responsible when they act on their desires. And that seems like the wrong result. Also, the ability to do otherwise, when they say, oh yeah, free will and responsibility requires the ability to do otherwise, but determinism doesn't pose a problem because if things had been differently, then the future could have been different. The future can't be different now because determinism is true, but if it had been different, and in particular, if the part of the past where you were, if you had been different, then you would have had possibly a different future. Okay, but this runs into problems. So imagine that Kelly is a hydrophobic, is incredibly fearful of water. So much so that let's just assume for the sake of argument, it's psychologically impossible that she wants to jump into the pool or into the lake. And therefore, it's psychologically impossible that she wants and chooses on the basis of that want to jump in. She just can't. She just can't form the desire to jump into the lake. She's hydrophobic. She just can't. That's just not the type of desire she can have. She might even say, like, man, I wish I could I wish I wanted to get in that lake. I kind of want to get in the lake. Maybe she can't even do that, right? The point is just imagine that it's psychologically impossible for her to want to jump in the lake and to choose to jump in the lake because she's so hydrophobic, right? Well, it's still going to be true that if Kelly were to want to jump in, if it were true, if the past had been a little different, and maybe she didn't have this psychological hang-up, which let's just say was the result of some traumatic event in her life, if that had been different, but everything else about Kelly was the same, then it would be possible for her to want to jump in the lake and to choose to jump in the lake. So if she were to want to jump in the lake, if it were true that she wanted to jump in the lake, then she would have chosen. So that's still true. And so you still get this ability to do otherwise, right? Even though it's just psychologically impossible in the actual world. And so that seems problematic because we don't really think that Kelly can jump in the lake. It's psychologically impossible for her to do that. But more importantly, it just kind of comes apart from free will in a way that is kind of unsatisfactory. So, okay, classical compatibilists, just about doing what you want without external impediments. They try to keep the ability to do otherwise with a conditional analysis, but most people are not classical compatibilists anymore. There's a group called the New Dispositionalists that I don't think we're going to talk about them. They come kind of close. They try to make it a little bit more sophisticated. We could talk about that on office hours if you want, but we're going to move to contemporary compatibilism. Okay, so contemporary compatibilists, in contrast to classical compatibilists, they focus on identifying what proper or normal functioning is of a human agent. So what is agency? This ability for people to control their actions, to govern themselves, to act for reasons, right? To do things that, to act in a way where when we know all the features of your actions, like what your mental states were like and how much you control yourself and what caused you to do what you wanted and the role that your intentions played and so on. If we knew all that stuff, right, then the question is, how should we describe all that stuff in a way that captures normal human agency? So when a person acts in a way that we would say, yes, they're exercising sort of proper or normal functioning of a human agent. What is that? That's the contemporary compatibilist focus, is trying to answer that question. What is proper or normal human agency? Proper or normal functioning of human agency. What is that? Because when you get that, then you get a normal sort of agent or human agent who's controlling themselves in a kind of normal way. They're functioning properly as a human agent. And that's what is going to amount to free and responsible action. When an action comes from proper or normal functioning of human agency. And there's two main ways in which contemporary compatibilists have understood this. One is mesh theories, what we'll call mesh theories. And they say that normal agency, this normal functioning of human agency, just amounts to having a harmonious meshing of your psychology. And your psychology, by that we mean the kind of psychological makeup or the mental makeup that you have at some time. So all the beliefs that you have, the intentions you have, the desires you have, the values you have, this sort of psychic cluster of mental states that you have, your psychology, your whole psychology at some time. If we took a time slice and we asked okay, what are all the beliefs you have right now? Yeah, you lose and gain beliefs, you lose and gain values, you lose and gain desires. Some of them stick around, some of them get modified. But the point is just the collection of all of those things, your beliefs, desires, all of your mental states, that's your psychology. Okay, and you can have desires that are competing. You might desire the cheesecake when you wake up in the middle of the night and get a craving, but you might also desire not to eat it because maybe you're on a diet or maybe you told yourself you want to eat that late. You can have conflicting desires. Obviously, this should be very unsurprising, right? You can even have incompatible beliefs because maybe you're just not really aware that they're incompatible, right? So your mental makeup, your psychology can conflict with itself in certain ways, and that's normal. That's totally normal. If it's too much conflict, right, we start getting into questions of abnormality and maybe dysfunction or disorder. But some inconsistency in your desires, your beliefs, right? If you believe that the Dodger game starts tonight at 6, but you want to go to the Dodger game on time, but your belief is false. Well, your desire is going to lead you, and your belief together are going to lead you to do something you don't really want to do, right? Because you're going to be there way too early or whatever. The point is just your psychological makeup can kind of not mesh sometimes. And that's fine, but the mesh theorists say the right kind of meshing. We want the right kind of meshing of your psychology, and that's what proper normal functioning is. Certain things need to be meshing. Maybe not everything, but certain things need to be meshing in order for your actions to be free. Okay, so a free action is one that is caused by an appropriately meshed or a properly meshed psychological makeup. And this will help to explain why certain desires are alien, for instance, like an addict who has a desire or like really strong craving to use, but maybe they really don't want to have that craving. And we'll get down to this. This kind of view is going to help us explain why those alien desires aren't really part of the person's sort of proper psychology, like who they are or whatever. Okay. So just in McKenna uses this analogy, in the same way that external impediments, like a roadblock or a river or something, could impede the ability for your car to go, right? Maybe you can't drive through the river, you can't drive through a roadblock, maybe you come to a cliff, you can't go anymore. External impediments. Maybe a cop puts a boot on your tire, right? There are also internal impediments. So if your internal combustion system, or I have no knowledge of cars, but something else in your engine, whatever, something in the internal system of your car, maybe electrical, maybe mechanical, if that is messing up, it's not meshing with each other properly. Things aren't talking to each other in the right way. They're not connecting in the right way. That can also impede normal operation of your car and make it so that you can't go. And that's kind of what this is getting at. It's not just about external impediments. It's about the internal system operating correctly. Okay. Now, reasons responsiveness theories are focusing on something a little different. They still focus on proper or normal functioning of a human agent, but instead of saying this harmonious mesh, reasons responsiveness theories say that normal agency is really about being sensitive to the right reasons and being appropriately sensitive. Because obviously being sensitive to the reasons is going to come in degrees, it seems. You can be more or less sensitive to different kinds of reasons. And so we want you to be appropriately sensitive to the relevant reasons. That's what reasons responsiveness is about. So free actions are caused by a suitably rational psychological system or mechanism, like your deliberative capacities or whatever. Suitably rational meaning they're suitably sensitive to reasons. That's being rational is about understanding and applying reasons in your actions. So this explains why, for instance, compulsions are not free. So if you're just completely compelled to do something, and even if we gave you a bunch of really good reasons not to do it and you understood them, you would still do it anyways, right? That seems like you're not free. And the reasons responsiveness theory can easily explain this and say, well, that's because the mechanism that's producing your action, some psychological mechanisms that's suffering from compulsion or suffering from too much influence by a craving or something like that, that mechanism's not appropriately sensitive to reasons. And these people who endorse these theories say that freedom and responsibility is just about being appropriately sensitive to the reasons. And so they can easily explain why something like a compulsion that's not sensitive to reasons would make you not free and responsible. Now, free will and responsibility is about the capacity to understand reasons and act in light of them on this view. Okay, so this is about having your psychology, freedom and responsibility is about having your psychology mesh in the right way, having your desires align with other parts of your psychology. This is about the capacity to understand reasons and to act in light of those reasons, to act for those reasons. Okay. All right, so we're going to look at these more closely, starting with this one, and then we'll move on to reasons responsiveness. So, We're going to talk a little bit about Gary Watson and Michael Bratman, but Harry Frankfurt, who you should recognize from the Frankfurt cases that argued that PAP was false, the principle of alternative possibilities. So Frankfurt thought that you do not need the ability to do otherwise in order to be free and responsible. You do not need that. Okay? You don't have to have multiple options. You can be determined and still be free. And we saw last week anyways, those arguments for that, the Frankfurt cases, where you have this counterfactual intervener. We're not going to talk about that today much. I don't know, maybe not even at all, but that's the same Harry Frankfurt who, the reason he was able to deny that you need alternative possibilities is because the way in which he thinks we're free is only about your action being caused by the right kind of mesh. Okay, and so it doesn't matter if you're determined, if your action was determined, as long as your action was caused by a properly meshed psychology, then that's good enough for free will and responsibility. So let's look at his some central concepts here. So desire, it's at the core of his account. His view is called a hierarchical theory, a hierarchical sort of mesh theory. And at the center of this, like what's supposed to be hierarchically meshing are these lower level or first order desires and these higher level desires. So we'll say, I'll cash that out right now. But the idea is that desires are going to be sort of the central kind of important part. There's a little bit more, but it's about having the right kinds of desires and having your desires aligned in the right way. At least centrally, that's what it's about. So a desire, just think of that as a motivational state, a motivational mental state. Okay, it's by motivational just mean one that has the ability to play a role in leading you to do stuff. So if you desire to drink coffee, then that part of that desire, or part of that desire's motivational character is its ability to sort of help move you to go drink coffee. If you want something from the fridge, if you desire to get something out of the fridge, and then you go get up and go get something out of the fridge, at least sometimes or in a normal circumstance, having that desire is part of what moves you, motivates you, like literally kind of causally moves you, you might think, to go do that thing. Okay, so desires are motivational. They help move you. They play a role in leading to actions. Okay, that's how we'll think of desires. Now, first order desires, what Frankfurt called first order desires, the difference between these two, and the bullet, like the kind of outline style here, these are all kinds of desires because they're under desire. So these are two kinds of desires. This is a kind of first order desire. It's a type of first order desire. And this is a type of higher order desire. So just the indenting here means that this is a type of this, and this is a type of this. This is a type of this, and this is also a type of this. So these are all desires. Okay, hopefully that makes sense. So a first order desire and a higher order desire differ in terms of their target. A first order desire is a desire that has an action as its target. I want to do A. I want to go to the store. I want to drink coffee. I want to eat ice cream. Right? That's that kind of desire, a first order desire at the lower level is just desires about what you want to do. Desires to do things. Okay. And then Frankfurt called some of those desires. So again, your desires can play a role in leading to your actions. Not every desire does, because remember, you can have conflicting desires. You can want to do two things that you can't do both of. You can say, like, I want to drink coffee right now, and I also want to not drink coffee right now. I can't drink and not drink coffee, right? That doesn't make any sense. So you can have two desires that you can't fulfill both of them. And therefore, you can have desires that don't play a role in leading to your action. Because if I desire to drink coffee and I desire not to drink coffee, maybe because I'm trying to quit, but I also still like it, so I want it. And then let's say I end up drinking the coffee. Well, then my desire to not drink coffee didn't play any role really in my action, right? In a certain sense. Okay, so a first order desire is desire like I want to do A or X or B or C or whatever. And a first order desire, one of these, a desire to do something that does actually play a role in your action, a desire that moves you, he calls your will. So your will, when he says, your desire to smoke cigarettes is your will, that means what he would mean by that is your desire to smoke cigarettes actually moved you to go perform some action, whether that's smoking cigarettes or buying them or looking for them or whatever. Okay, so first order desire, just a desire to do something. It has an action as its target. And then whenever that first order desire actually moves you, actually plays a role in causing your action, he calls that the will. Now, a higher order desire is a desire that doesn't have an action. It's not like I should maybe highlight this or something. That's the desire part. I want to, boom, and this is the thing you desire. Okay. So on the higher order desire, the target of your desire is just another desire. Okay, so you can see now, like the blue is the desire part. I want to, and then the green is the target of your desire. I want to do A, and so when your desire has an action as its target, it's first order, lower level. But then you can desire about your desires. You can want to have certain desires. We just talked about this with the hydrophobic, right? Maybe she's like, man, I wish I wanted to jump in the lake. Seems like everyone's having fun, but I don't want to because I'm so scared of it, right? And like an addict, I wish I didn't have these desires for alcohol or cigarettes or whatever. So when your desires are about your own desires, I want to do A, right? I like the fact that I want to do A. I like that desire. I want to have that desire, right? And it might be the other way. I want to not have the desire to do A. When your desires take your other desires as a target, that's called a higher order desire. And hopefully it makes sense why it's called higher order, because it's kind of these levels to your desires, right? You can desire the A, you can desire to do A, or you can desire that you desire to do A. And of course you can see we can probably keep going. You can desire that you desire to do A. Now, when your higher order desire also says that you not only do you want to have that desire, but you want that desire to be your will. You want it to be effective in playing a role in your actions. That's called a volition. For instance, I want my desire to do A to actually cause me to do A. You put that little extra. You don't just want certain desires. So if you want certain desires, that's a higher order desire. Okay, a desire for a desire. But when a volition adds a little more, a volition is like, not only do I want this desire, but I want that desire to be my will. I want that desire to actually be effective in causing me to act. So think of an addict. Not only do they want the desire to quit, they want their desire to quit to be their will, to be effective in their actions, to actually have influence on helping them quit, right? So first order desire, I want to do A. A will is when a desire like this actually causes you to do the thing. A higher order desire is a desire for a desire. I want to do A. And then a volition adds a little bit more. It's not only do I want to do A, but I want to do A, and I want my desire to do A to actually be effective in causing me to do A. That's a volition. Okay. So we get some other distinctions from that. Okay, now first we have this causal link for Frankfurt between, so your volitions, I want my desire to do A to be effective in causing me to do A, will bring about your will, a first order desire to do A that actually plays a role. and then that will bring about the action. So volition, wanting certain of your desires to be effective, is what brings about those desires being effective, and therefore brings about the actions when they're effective. Okay, now, with this kind of picture, volitions bring about your will, your effective desires, and your effective desires bring about your actions. Frankfurt says, acting freely means that the relation between your will and your action is unimpeded. Okay, this relation here, when you have a desire that actually plays a role in causing you to act, and nothing impedes that, so nobody's forcing you, right? It's not like I desire to do something and then a neuroscientist puts a chip in my head and makes that desire effective, right? We don't want any of that, okay? When the will, the connection between the will, your effective desires bringing about your action, when that's unimpeded, that's acting freely. And you don't need determinism for that. This is why this is called source. The difference between source and leeway is about alternative possibilities. So this kind of freedom needs alternative possibilities. That's why it's red, because Frankfurt doesn't think we need this kind of freedom. It's a concept. So here he's like, this is what it means for your action to be free. In one sense, just means that your will can bring about your action without any impediments. But there's another sense. You might add, well, you can have your will bring about your actions without any impediments, but also it might be true that you could have acted otherwise. So if your desire to do A actually makes you do A, that's this. If you have it, this is like classical compatibilists. If you have a desire to do A and nothing impedes you, and then your desire to do A is effective and it makes you do A, then that's called acting freely. But freedom of action is when all that's true, but also you could have acted otherwise. You had a different possibility to do. And Frankfurt thinks we don't need this. And this is good, but we're going to want a little more. And so he's going to talk about acting of your own free will. Okay. So these kinds of freedom have to do with action, free action. So an action is free in one sense when the will can bring it about without any impediments. But an action might also be free when the will can bring it about without any impediments, and then you could have acted otherwise. But you don't need this much. He just thinks this is one sense. But then we might talk about your will being free. Not just your actions being free, so no impediments here, but your will might be free. So when the will is free, or acting of one's own free will, that means the relation between your volition, this thing, your higher order desire, your want for some of your other desires to be effective, that volition that you have, and the relationship between that and those desires that you're wanting to be effective, when this relation is unimpeded. This relation. Okay. He's going to add more to this. We'll see. It's called identification, but we'll get to that. But acting of one's own free will is, at least initially, about the relationship between your volition and your will. Remember, your will are your first order desires that actually move you. So if you want your desire to quit smoking to be effective, I want my desire to quit smoking to actually be effective in causing me to quit smoking. That's a volition. So that higher order desire that you have for your desire to quit smoking to be effective, that's a volition. And when that volition can actually bring about the desire to quit smoking and can help bring it about in being effective, that connection right there is acting of one's own free will. Plus some identification, which we'll talk about below. Now, the same thing. There's another, so that's one sense in which the will can be free, acting of one's own free will. And that's all Frankfurt really wants, plus this other condition coming below. But you might also think that freedom of the will, like freedom of action, is the idea that not only can your volition bring about your will, but it could have brought about a different will, right? You could have willed something else. And Frankfurt thinks we don't need that. Okay, we don't need alternative possibilities for Frankfurt. We just need, as I said before, above, we just need the right kind of causal connection between your action and your will, your desires that move you, and between your will, your desires that move you, and your higher order desires. We want the right kind of connection between those as well. And when you get that, right, when it's unimpeded, then you get acting of your own free will. So we'll look at this a little bit. Have a person who's doing some action. So here's the person kind of just not necessarily thinking, but just their psychology. So here's somebody with some of their psychology up here, right? They want to do A, but they also want to do B. And let's pretend they can't do both A and B. So these are first order desires. I want to do B. I want to do A, right? But the first order desire that actually helps cause them to do that thing, that's the will. Your will is your affective desires. Now you might be wondering what these little pictures are. The idea is that Frankfurt thought animals can have these. Of course, animals have desires. They want food. They want to go outside to go to the bathroom. They want to mate. They want to get scratched, whatever, right? They want to, if you're a bear, you want to rub your back on a tree. You have these desires, right? Like, of course, maybe they're not as sophisticated in terms of their content as ours, but who knows, whatever, it doesn't matter. The point is just animals have motivations, motivational states, right? And that's why, excuse me, sorry. That's why this is not enough, right? When you have a desire that can cause you to act, gosh dang it, sorry. When you have a desire that can cause you to act, that's not enough for free will in the sort of human sense, because animals can do that. They can have desires that play a role in causing them to go get the food or whatever it is. So we need a little more. Your higher order desires are things like, I want to do B. And so maybe you don't mind this desire. Maybe it's not a bad desire. You do want that desire. But after you think about it, maybe you want your desire to do A to actually be your will, though. You're like, I don't mind having both of these desires. I like both of these things, and I just need to pick one. And then you think, okay, I want my desire to do A to be effective. And then it is having that extra that not only do you want to do B, but you want to do A, and you want A to be effective, to be your will. That's the volition. Okay, these are both higher order desires, but the volition is the one where not only do you want this desire, but you want it to be effective in causing your action. That's a volition. Okay. And Frankfurt thought maybe some animals can even want some of their desires. Want some of their desires, right? Maybe some animals can desire that they have certain desires. It's unclear. Maybe higher order animals like chimps or apes. But the volition, he thought, that's human. Only humans can want their desires to actually be their will, to be effective in action. Okay, and so remember, volition brings about your will, helps bring about the fact that your desire is effective, and your will desires that influence or help bring about your action, Right? So those are the components. First order desires, just wanting to do stuff. The will is the desires that are effective. And higher order desires are desires about which desires you want to have. And your volition is when not only do you want to have a desire, but you want that desire to be effective. Okay, that's a volition. And only people can do that. Or at least human-like agents. I don't know what he thought about aliens or angels. Okay, so now here's the additional here's the additional condition. dang it. So I get, there we go. Is that good? Yes. All right. The additional condition is called identification. Okay. So not only, and by additional condition, I mean additional condition to this. Acting of one's own free will means that the relation between your volition, and your will is unimpeded. So you form this higher order desire, and it's like targeted at, I want this desire to be effective. And when there's no nonsense going on, when there's no tinkering by neuroscientists, there's no like weird stuff going on between your higher order desire, that's your volition, and your desire that's your will, and then it causes your action. When there's no impediments there, when there's no funny stuff going on, that's part of what it takes to act of your own free will, which is the core piece. But you also need what he calls identification. You have to identify with your desire, okay? The desire that you act on. So volitions can conflict. This is why the identification comes in. So even your higher orders, this might turn into a higher order desire. You might think, well, I want my desire to do A to be effective because I really want to do A, but I also want my desire to do B to be effective because I really like doing B. You might just be like really torn, right? Not only in your first order desires, you have competing wants, but even after you think about it, you might have competing higher order wants, right? And because of that, just having a mesh between your volition and your will is not enough. Just having the desire that moves you mesh with a volition, that might not be enough because you might have some other volition. You might want this to be effective as well. And then it's unclear whether this was really you or wanting B to be effective is kind of the real you. So just having that mesh is not enough. So you have to also identify with the first order desire that comes to be effective. Okay, so this is what it takes. You want your desire to do A to be effective. That's the volition. I want my desire to do A to be my will, my effective desire. Your desire to do A is effective. So it is effective. That's why it's the will. It partly causes your action. And your volition involves endorsing this desire. You're like, yeah, that desire is really me. That really represents who I am, how I want to act, who I want to be. Okay. Therefore, free will and responsibility is about unimpeded links between your psychology here, your volition and your will, and your action, plus a kind of endorsement or identification with the desire that you act on. You have to think that it sort of represents who you want to be. Okay. Now this is what's called a non-historical view. Well, let me just go here at the same time. This is kind of basically like this, but only it's going to focus on adding the identification. Endorsement. Okay. So you have your will. I want to do A, and that partly causes you to do A, so it's your will. This is a first order desire that is effective, and so that's just what a will is. Now your volition, I want my desire to do A to be my will. That's a higher order desire because it's about this desire. But it's a volition because it's not only about this desire, it's about wanting this desire to be effective. Okay, so you get all the stuff that we had up here. Volition about this, and this is effective. But then we have to add, I identify with my desire to do A. I like this desire. I not just like it, but it represents me. It's something, it doesn't have to be this robust, but something I've thought about. I identify with that kind of person who would do A. That kind of higher order thought, not clear if it's a desire or a judgment, but this kind of higher order thought, yes, the desire to do A is representative of me. That's needed. Because you can have conflicting desires and you might have conflicting volitions. And so when you add the endorsement of what you're doing, the endorsement of the desire that causes you to do what you do, then that's when you get freedom. Now, this is a non-historical view, which means it doesn't matter how all this stuff came about. It doesn't matter where your desires came from. Not really. It doesn't matter where your volition comes from. Identification even, maybe more questionable. But the point is that we don't have to tell the causal story about what's going on over here. It's just about at some particular time, namely the time right before you act. So think of this as you acted, and then we go back to the moment before action and look at how your psychology was that caused you to act. And as long as you get the proper alignment, the proper meshing of all this psychology that caused you to act, that's all you need. So we don't have to look at the causal history of how you got this psychology. We don't have to care about that. And therefore, it should hopefully seem intuitive now, determinism just doesn't matter. It doesn't matter if you were determined to have the psychology. It doesn't matter if this psychology determined that you would act this way. What matters is that your action is caused by a psychology that looks like this, is caused by a desire to do that thing, and you also have a volition, a higher order desire, that you have that desire and that desire caused you to do that thing. So not only do you want to do A, and your want to do A causes you to do A, but you want all this to happen. You want your desire to do A to be your will, to be effective. And finally, you identify with this desire. You endorse it. If you get all that structure, your action was free. And you act, and not only did you act freely, but you acted of your own free will. Okay. This is your will, and acting of your own free will means you had all this stuff behind it that it aligns with. That's the idea. Now here's an example to kind of illustrate this. Think of the two addicts. One's a willing addict and one's an unwilling addict. So this is kind of going to show an example of acting of your own free will or not. Like it's going to show one of them acting of their own free will and the other not acting of their own free will. So consider Jim and Amy, both of whom are addicts, and they have irresistible first-order desires, right? So they have desires to, say, use heroin, but they're irresistible in the sense that the person can't do anything except for act on those desires. They can't do anything else, can't do otherwise. The desires are so strong that they're irresistible, okay? But in one case, for Jim, he's a willing addict. He likes his desire to use heroin. So even though it's irresistible, he endorses it. He's like, yeah, I want that desire to do heroin to be effective. I want that to be my will. I want it to move me to do heroin. I like doing heroin. I identify with being a heroin addict and having those desires. Right? So if he has all that meshing psychology, then Frankfurt says Jim acts of his own free will and is responsible. Because his addictive desires are his own in a certain sense. He kind of owns his desire by wanting it to move him to action, endorsing it, right? He's like, yeah, I like those desires. So having that sort of mesh kind of seems like it makes it so that his desires to do heroin kind of represent who he is. They represent his kind of true self. Now imagine the same exact thing, same exact setup, except instead of endorsing them and being a willing addict, you have an unwilling addict. So Amy does not want her desire for heroin to be effective. Whoops. Right? She does not want her first order desire for heroin to be her will. She doesn't want it to be effective in leading her to do heroin. She struggles against it. She does do heroin because it's irresistible. Right? We just assume that for the sake of argument. Just assume it's irresistible. But she doesn't want to do it. She's just like a kind of, and I don't mean to say that this is what addiction is like, sort of essentially, that like all addicts are like this. It's just an example. But we just imagine that it's like basically saying, oh gosh, dang it, I just lost my thought. Her desire to do heroin, she does not identify with it, right? So it's basically like saying she is a victim of her desire. She succumbs sort of against her will to use heroin. And she doesn't endorse the desires. She really wishes these desires would go away and she could get help. Okay. because of that, because her psychology is not appropriately meshed, right? She has this desire to do heroin, but that's because she has an addiction. And it's irresistible, so it sort of causes her. So it is her will, but she doesn't act of her own free will because she doesn't have this stuff. This stuff is gone for Amy. She does not desire this thing. She doesn't want it to be effective. She does not endorse it. Okay? She's an unwilling addict. And because of that, she doesn't act of her own free will, and she's not responsible, according to Frankfurt. Okay? This is the sense in which desires can be alien and don't represent your true self. Okay, now, even though neither of them can do otherwise, right? It's not like Jim is free and responsible because he can do otherwise. He has the ability to resist his desires. And she's not because, no. They're both irresistible. Neither of them can do anything about the fact that they're going to use heroin. But one's free and one's not because of their alignment of their desires. Jim's desires align with his higher order desires, and he endorses them. Amy, not so much. Remember, it's not about the ability to do otherwise. Because Frankfurt argued against PAP, the principle of alternative possibilities that says responsibility requires alternative possibilities. It requires the ability to do otherwise. He doesn't like this. He rejects this. So the ability to do otherwise cannot make the difference here. Because he doesn't care about that. What makes the difference between them is that one of them has a proper alignment, a proper meshing of their psychology, including the fact that they endorse their effective desire. And the other person doesn't have this stuff. That's the difference. That's why a willing addict is responsible and an unwilling addict is not. Okay, now let's look at some problems. One problem is that Frankfurt's theory has a little bit of trouble, it seems, dealing with manipulation cases, which we've seen. So I don't want to go into these in too much detail because we've looked at these quite a bit. So you have to go back to the compatibilist burden from above. The compatibilist is supposed to be giving us sufficient conditions. So this higher order stuff, all this like, here's what it means to be free, here you go, is to want your desire to be effective, that your desire is effective, your will caused you to act, and your volition involves this kind of endorsement where you identify with the desire that's effective. All of that is supposed to be enough, not just required for free will. It's not just required. It's sufficient. It's like whenever you get that stuff, alignment of your desires in that way, then you get free action, free will, and moral responsibility. And so opponents have tried to show that you can get all those conditions. You can get someone with the right kind of mesh in their psychology, but you get it through manipulation. And that seems like, so right, you can have someone be manipulated into having proper alignment, right? But since they're manipulated, it seems like it undermines the idea that they're free and responsible. Now remember that Frankfurt's view is non-historical. It doesn't care about the history. It doesn't care about how the alignment came about. It's about the alignment of psychology at some time, not concerned with how it came about, which means you can bring it about by manipulation, right? You can have like a neuroscientist manipulate someone into having a certain set of desires, a certain psychology. And in the chapter, McKenna talks about Al Mealy's case of Anne and Beth, where neuroscientists come in the middle of the night and like rearrange her psychology while she's sleeping, so that she has a psychology that's identical to this other person. But we might think, well, one person, when let's say it's an evil psychology, one person's actually really evil. They not necessarily anything deviant, but they just became an evil person, let's just say. And the other person was really a nice person, a good person. But then one night, when they're an adult, psychologists came in and rearranged or neuroscientists came in and rearranged their psychology so that it's exactly like the evil person's. And then they wake up the next morning, just like the evil person, and each of them go and perform some evil action. Well, you might think the person who was manipulated in the middle of the night is not free and responsible, or at least is much less free and responsible because they were manipulated. Normally they're a good person. And so we've kind of changed who they are, you might think. And at least temporarily, right? And so the manipulation seems to put pressure on the idea that they're free and responsible. But because those conditions, the alignment, is all that is supposed to matter, when they go do some evil action, as long as it was caused by a properly meshed psychology, which now the person has, it's properly meshed in the free will sense, maybe not in the moral sense, because they're doing something evil. They have a properly meshed evil psychology. But it's properly meshed, right? Meaning they want to kill the person, that desire to kill the person is effective in causing them to kill the person. They endorse that desire to kill the person because now they're evil after their manipulation. And they want that desire to... They have all this stuff, but it seems like they shouldn't be free or responsible because they were manipulated. And it's not clear how Frankfurt can respond to that. Well, sorry, it's not clear that the view is right. I say it's not clear that there's plausible responses. So one thing he could do is just bite the bullet, which is just what Frankfurt does. And he says, well, I guess they are responsible and free, even though they were manipulated. Oh, well. So we call this biting the bullet because it seems like an unattractive answer. Or you can add a historical condition. Right? You can describe or explain what the free will and responsibility undermining features are, like being manipulated. But you can't be ad hoc. You can't just say, okay, you need all this alignment stuff, my whole account up here, you need all this, plus no manipulation. That's ad hoc. Right? You have to kind of say what counts as manipulation, and you have to say why it's irrelevant or responsibility undermining. So some people do try to add these historical conditions. But in any case, that's one worry at least, is if all it takes is having proper meshing psychology, then what happens if you're just manipulated to have that meshing psychology? So that's an objection to think about. A second objection is that Frankfurt's theory can't seem to capture what we call weak-willed actions. Okay, where weak-willed actions are where you don't really mesh. Your actions don't really mesh. So you want to do A, well, it'd be more like this one. You want to do A, you want to do B, you want your desire to do A to be effective because you think, all things considered, I think A is the best thing to do. But just imagine instead of A causing it, B caused it. Weak-willed is like, it's like when you, the way that it kind of gets described by philosophers is that you judge something to be the best thing to do. They sometimes say all things considered best thing to do. You think, given all the evidence, given all the things that are relevant, I think it's best to not eat the cheesecake because I get that I'm craving it. I get that it would taste good, but I'm on a diet and I value my diet more than just a momentary tastiness. I want to value my own integrity. I want to stick with my work ethic, in this diet plan that I have, whatever else. And you think about all this stuff and you think, okay, I'm going to judge after reflecting on it that it's best to not eat the cheesecake. But then imagine you still have the desire. That doesn't mean your desire to eat the cheesecake goes away, right? And then as you're closing the fridge, you like get one last glance at it and you say, excuse me, but you say, fuck it. and you just grab the cheesecake and you eat it, right? Even though you've just judged that it was best not to do that, right? That's weak-willed action, where your actions don't align with what you think it's best to do. Okay. So imagine a weak-willed addict has this strong, not irresistible, but really strong desire to use drugs. Or like my example, someone on a diet who has a really strong desire to eat cheesecake. It's not irresistible, but it's really strong. But they also have a conflicting desire to not use drugs or to not use cheesecake, right? Now suppose that the volition and endorsement align with not using or not eating, right? Your higher order stuff, You're like, I don't want to use. I want my desire to not use, or I want my desire to not eat the cheesecake. That's what I want to be effective, and that's what I endorse. But because you're weak-willed, momentary, failure of your judgment, or momentary failure of getting your actions to align with your judgment, you still end up succumbing to the thing. This happens, right? Most people think that weak-willed actions can be free and responsible, because it's not like you're, you have a mental disorder, like you're suffering from some chronic compulsion, like a severe addict or something like that. We perform weak-willed actions all the time. People perform weak-willed actions all the time. We say we're going to do something, and we think about it, and we actually believe that some particular action is the best thing to do, and then we end up not doing it, right? These little things, right? Gosh, I should really take a nap later today because I have certain things I need to do later, and I'm really tired, and I should nap, and then, you just end up not doing it. Or I should work on my, homework or my paper starting at noon today, whatever. And then noon comes around and you're like, I'll do it later, whatever. These weak-willed actions, most people think they're free and responsible. But Frankfurt's theory seems to have a problem capturing that. Because if your volition and your endorsement is aligned with your non-using, but then because you're weak-willed and just on a one-off occasion you end up using or eating the cheesecake or whatever it is, you're not free and responsible. Because in order to be free and responsible, the thing that causes you to act has to be aligned with your higher order desires and your endorsement. And in weak-willed actions, it's not. So Frankfurt has to deny that weak-willed actions are free and responsible. And most people think they are. So that's kind of a cost of the theory. All right. A third problem is that Frankfurt's theory has a hard time making sense of identification. It's not really clear what identification is supposed to be, and it's not really clear why identification isn't arbitrary. So Gary Watson, who we'll look at in just a minute, says, how does decisively committing to or identifying with a desire, how does that get you responsibility? Like, what does it mean? What does this mean? We could put a thought bubble and say, I identify with my desire to do A. What does that mean? Is that another desire? Is that a judgment? Is it an action? Like a basic action where you think about it and then make a sort of mental action of judging? Like, what is that thing? And secondly, why doesn't the identification of your desire require a story? Why don't you have to identify with your identification? If you have a desire and that thing causes you to act, Frankfurt thinks, well, that's not enough. You have to desire that you desire that thing to act. You have to have this second order, higher order desire. But also you have to identify with that thing. Well, why don't you have to have another desire that you have all this stuff together and identify with that desire? And where does the endorsement come from? I don't know if I have no. Okay, I thought maybe I had a picture of that, but the point is why don't you get a regress? Why can't we ask of your identification whether that was free? Did you freely endorse? It seems like you could manipulate someone into endorsing, and so why do we just stop at the first sort of second order desire? That seems like a valid question. And Frankfurt's attempts to answer this seem unsatisfactory. So he says, well, what is a decisive commitment? What does it mean to identify with your desires? Well, it means your volition is unopposed. And this is one thing he said before. And you have this judgment that you don't need to deliberate anymore. Well, an unopposed volition, meaning you don't have another volition for some other desire. So like this is unopposed. You have conflicting desires, but not conflicting volitions. This is not a volition. It's just a desire to have this desire. This is not just a desire to have this desire. It's a desire that this desire be effective. And so you could have conflicting volitions. You might have a desire that this desire be effective and a desire that this desire be effective. That would be conflicting. And so Frankfurt's proposal here is that, well, you have to have an unopposed volition and then some judgment that no more deliberation is necessary. Well, it's like, that seems like we can't have free will whenever we're conflicted. And I don't know why that would be the case. But it doesn't give us a story about the judgment. If we need some judgment that deliberation over our action is no longer necessary, can we ask whether that judgment was free? Where did that judgment come from? Is that judgment endorsed? So we can just raise these same questions again. Right? But then he gives another possible thing. He's like, okay, well, identification is about satisfaction, where you have your complete psychological makeup, but then you don't have any tendency to change it. You have no inclination to change your psychological makeup. Sorry. So this seems to suggest that the person is their whole psychology. Okay? If what it means to endorse a desire, or like have the desire sort of represent your true self, is just that you don't have any inclination to change your psychology. There's just a lack of any desire to change yourself. Well, it seems then that you're just identified with your entire psychological makeup. But not necessarily that that's like incoherent or something. It's just that we thought that the mesh theory was supposed to tell us how you have some alien desires. And it's not clear that we can just identify you with your whole entire psychological makeup and still account for alien desires. If you are your whole psychology, then you're not going to have any alien desires. And the only way, it seems like the only response he can make here is that, well, when you have this tendency to change your psychological makeup, then you have alien desires. But it's not clear that you need that. It's not clear that you need like a inclination to change your psychology in order to have alien desires. You might not even be aware that your desire is alien. And so you don't have a tendency to want to change it because you're not even really aware of it. That seems possible. So in any case, another problem is that identification seems to be an absence, which is weird because it seems like an endorsement or identification is something that you would do. It's a judgment or a evaluation or something like that. But identification is just the lack of something, which seems weird. But it also just seems like you can be manipulated into having a psychological makeup that doesn't have any inclination to change it. And so you still get manipulation worries here. So those are three problems to worry about. What identification is, why there isn't a regress of identification or of higher order desires. Why do we just stop at the first higher order desire? Why don't you need a third higher order desire, a higher order desire to have this and to have this and identify with these things? Like, it's just not clear why we stopped. It just seems arbitrary to say that one is enough. Okay, now we'll look at Gary Watson, who raised this worry. He likes the view, but he raised this worry about identification. He wasn't really sure what that meant. But he invoked another kind of mesh theory, where instead of hierarchical, where you have one desire and then a higher order desire, a desire for that desire, instead of that, you have the structure, what's called the structural theory, which is basically about these two systems, the motivational system and then the judgment, evaluative judgment system. Okay, so you have wants, I want to do B, I want to do A, but you also have these judgments. You think, all things considered, it's best that I do A, right? And you think about the things, it's kind of like maybe rational capacities are involved here, and this is just more motivational, desire-like states. Okay, so he focused on an appropriate mesh, but not a hierarchy, right? It's this harmony between these two systems. Your motivation system, desires, and your rational or evaluative system, the judgments that you make. And when those are aligned, when those mesh, that's when you get a free action. Okay, your evaluative judgment of the all things considered
good. That means like taking into account all the relevant evidence that you have. When your evaluative judgment of what it is all things considered good to do. So when this evaluative judgment aligns with your desires, with your affective desires, your desires that cause you to do things, when those align, when you have a desire that causes you to do something, and that aligns with your evaluative judgment, that is identification for Watson. That's what it means for your action to like sort of truly represent who you are. Okay, and so freedom and responsibility for Watson, he kind of takes the Frankfurt model and just modifies it. It's about acting in accordance with your deliberative judgments about what it's best to do. Okay. So similar, but instead of this hierarchy of desires, you get these like two sort of parallel systems that need to be in line with each other. The desires that cause you to act need to be aligned with, or they need to be in accordance with what you judge it best to do. Okay. Now it's also susceptible to objections, many of them the same as before. Is the judgment free? Why don't we have to ask whether this is free? Or the way that they came about, right? Manipulation. Is manipulation a worry here? Seems like you also get no free weak-willed actions, because if you consider it all things, everything considered, as considering all the evidence, you think it's best to do A, right? But then now imagine you just do B. It's like the weak-willed thing again, right? You're like, it's best that I don't eat this cheesecake. I know I want to, but it's best that I not because of all these things. And then at the last second, you're like, fuck it. And you just eat the cheesecake. Well, that's weak-willed because your desires and your action, the affective desire, did not align with your all things considered best judgment. So that's weak-willed, but he's going to have to say it's not free then. And in fact, he does say that. And Watson argues that there is actually no such thing as weak-willed actions. He thinks we never do anything that's against what we judge is best to do. That should sound counterintuitive to you. He tries to argue for that, and there's, I don't know if this is his theory, but there's what's called this judgment shift theory, where people say, when you act in a way that does not align with your judgment about what it's best to do, if you say, it's best that I don't punch this person, and then you punch them, what these people say, who deny weak-willed actions, they say, oh, well, at the last second, sort of without even knowing it, you changed your judgment about what it's best to do. So right before you acted, you kind of unconsciously shifted your judgment, and you thought that it's best to punch the person, actually. You wouldn't have punched them unless your judgment changed. That's what they'll say. That's a controversial view, but that's what they have to say. That's what at least what Watson has to say. Sorry, not Watson. I put Watson here. Is it Watson? Yeah, it is Watson. Okay. Sorry, there's another compatibilist named R.J. Wallace, and I was confused for a second. Anyways. Why aren't your desires the self? So it seems like Watson is saying your evaluative judgment is really kind of taking the lead here. And so if you do something based on a desire that does not align with your judgments, then he's like, oh, well, that's not free. That's not proper alignment. Like, well, why not? Why aren't your desires about or connected to your true self? Why is judgment taking the lead here? Can you not just sort of act spontaneously on your desires, but in a free way, without even thinking about it, without making any judgments? He's going to have to say no. And the question is why? Okay. Another guy named Michael Bratman has this planning theory of responsibility. So basically and free will, what he thinks is important is not hierarchical alignment of desires, not structural meshing of the evaluative and the motivational system, but it's harmony between what he calls self-governing policies and then more immediate plans and intentions and so on. Self-governing policies are these higher order intentions, not higher order desires, even though desires might be a part of that. Higher order diachronic, meaning across time or long term. There are these intentions to be a certain way over time. Okay, it's like forming a long-term plan. I intend to always, treat people with respect. That's not a plan about any particular time. It's not like I plan to treat the first person I see tomorrow with respect. No. It's like I plan to be respectful towards people. That's you might form this intention. I intend to be respectful towards people. And in doing that, you form this self-governing policy. It's kind of like a rule, a policy you give yourself about how you're going to act. And those self-governing policies, they kind of restrict the way that you can act or make plans over time. So if you're like, I'm going to be the type of person, one of my self-governing policies is that I'm going to be respectful to people. And then the next day, someone's like, hey, you want to plan to go egg my neighbor's house? And you don't even know this person. Like, oh, what did they do to you? Like, oh, nothing. I just think it would be funny. We're like, you can't form the intention or start planning or even want really to do that thing if you have this self-governing policy, this long-term diachronic intention to respect people. It's going to conflict with your self-governing policy. And since this is a more long-term kind of deliberative, like deep-seated rule that you want to follow, intention or plan that you want to follow, it's going to take precedent in constraining the other kind of more immediate little plans and intentions that you want to make. Like whether or not you intend to egg your friend's neighbor's house who you don't know and who has done nothing to your friend, right? So that's going to conflict. And then it's also just like you can't make plans that conflict with each other. If you're like, I'm going to be keep my promises and my plans with my friends, and then one friend is like, hey, do you want to go to the movies tomorrow? And you're like, yeah, sure, let's do it tomorrow at 6. And then another friend calls you like an hour later, is like, hey, do you want to come over to my house for dinner tomorrow at 6? And you're like, yeah, for sure, that sounds fun, I'll do that. But no, you're being irrational, right? Because you're forming plans that conflict not only with each other, but with this policy of keeping your promises towards your friends. You can't keep both promises. And so you can't make plans that conflict and that are going to make you have to break one of those promises. Right? So our true self then, let me go back. Free will and moral responsibility is about acting in accordance with your deep, sort of long-term commitments, plans, intentions about who you want to be. Our true self is extended over time, for Bratman, in a coherent set of these self-governing policies. So these self-governing policies that we form about how we want to be, and that last kind of over time and help constrain the way in which we act in particular moments, that's really kind of what our true self is. Right? So you might think like, here's your deliberating about what to do. You're like, I intend to do B, I intend to do A. You might, and let's say A and B are can't go together. Right? These are kind of like your immediate. You're like, I want to go to the movies. I intend to go to the movies with John. I intend to go over to Mary's house for dinner. And I was like, okay, well, those conflict. If you have this self-governing policy or set of policies that are saying like, I intend to do A-like things, but not B-like things. Or you might say, to make it better, I intend to go help my friend later. And I intend to break that promise right before I go. Well, it's like, if you have this policy where you intend to help people, but not to break promises, then the red one's going to conflict with your self-governing policy. That's why it's red. Right? And the green one does not. And so if your actions align, if the intentions and desires that you have, that cause you to do actions, if the things that cause you to act align with these self-governing policies that you have that carry over time, then that's what it means to be free. Because that's what it means to act according to your true self. Because it's this stuff. The long-term self-governing policies are really who you are. Okay. But then more objections come. Is this free? How you form your self-governing policies? How do we know that that's free? And really you, right? Is there no you before the self-governing policies are formed? Again, weak-willed actions are not going to be free. If you have some like long-term self-governing policy to be healthy and a good employee and a good friend and a good family member, and then you start getting into using drugs, and let's say you have this desire that misaligns with those things, and you perform some weak-willed action because you have these really strong desires, but it doesn't align with your more long-term goals. Well, if you're not really a severe addict yet, and it's just weak-willed action, people are going to want to think, well, can't weak-willed actions be free? And it's not clear how they can on Bratman's view, at least some of them. How about spontaneous free actions? Some people think you can just spontaneously do something that's free, even though it doesn't align with anything that you might not even be thinking. You're just like randomly like, you know what? I'm just going to quit my job today. I think I want to just go start a new life. I'm going to go move to, I don't know, Pennsylvania and go be an accountant. Like, why can't I do that? Like, it doesn't align with anything, any of my self-governing policies, at least not a lot of them. And you might just like do something that seems totally out of character, but it's not clear why you can't have these spontaneous, what seem like out of character free actions. And Bratman's gonna have a really hard time explaining that on his view, more so I think than other people, like Watson and Frankfurt. Okay, and then identity here, like literally personal identity, who you are, like what you are, is going to be what's called Lockean. It's going to be these psychological connections between these higher order states that sort of make up who you are. And so if you do something like I just said, like have these kind of crazy spontaneous actions that go completely against your deeply held sort of self-governing policies and intentions and plans and values, not only is Bratman not going to be able to say that that can be free, but he's going to say that that's going to be against your own identity. It's going to be like an alien action. And if that action changes, if you go through with it and it changes sort of who you are, you've had literally an identity destroying action. And you, in a very real sense, kind of become someone else. And that seems very odd. So, or at least controversial. So, all right. That is, that's the end of the mesh theory views. And I think what I'm going to do is stop there for now and do kind of a part 1, part 2, because I don't want the video to run too long, because then it's just kind of annoying to upload it. So I'll stop there for now and I'll come back. I'll just finish it right now, but you'll see a part 2 on the contemporary compatibilism. And we'll talk about the reasons responsiveness theories. All right, thanks.